My colleagues up in the panel today is Carlos Coimbra, faculty member from MAE and member of Center for Energy Research as well. Shirley Meng, who's in the faculty in nanoengineering. Byron Washam, who's the director of strategic energy initiatives here at UC San Diego, and myself. We heard a bit at the early part of the events about why energy matters, but I thought I would just, a number I know came in late. I thought I'd just sort of remind us of why we care about the topic. It's not inherently interesting, at least not for me, but it's interesting and important because of the implications of access to energy. In an interesting paper in the 1970s, Roger Revelle, who was one of the founders of UCSD, was studying agriculture in India and the effect of energy on agricultural practice. And the paper ended with this quote. It said, "All ancient civilizations, no matter how enlightened or creative, rested on slavery and grinding labor because human and animal muscle power were the principal forms of energy available for work. The discovery of ways to use less expensive forms of energy than human muscle makes it possible for men to be free." And Revelle's not talking about political freedom there. He's talking about the freedom to pursue other interests besides trying to grow enough food simply to survive. And that was the gist of that paper. And so the impact of energy is because of what it allows us to do as human beings. This is an illustration of a graphic illustration of that fact. Childhood mortality, that is, of every 1,000 children who are born, how many survive to their 5th birthday, or how many die actually before their 5th birthday, plotted versus annual energy access on the horizontal axis. And there's a scatter of data points that I show here. I'll use the laser pointer, that illustrates countries around the world in 2008, and then to make the plot, I showed the data from 4 countries in Egypt, China, Brazil, and Bangladesh as a function of time from the early 70s until a couple years ago, and you can see everyone is following this sort of a trajectory. And if you were to make a cool movie of this, you'd see all of these data points 100 years ago were up here. And over time, we're moving down towards this reduced childhood mortality. This is not a causal effect, as David was talking about in his opening comments, but there's a correlation between access to adequate amount of energy and childhood mortality. There are many such relationships that can go over mortality, lifespan, literacy rates, average years of education, family size, and population growth rate. And access to adequate energy supplies, and in particularly the correlation is strongest for access to electricity, probably as a marker for much more complex demographics and social changes, are I would say, a necessary but not sufficient condition for improvements in these measures. And so that is reflected in this HDI index as a function of energy per person, and so you see the strong correlation here, as David again showed. There are very large variations in per capita electricity access around the world. This is a plot illustrating that point, and so the size of the circles is the population in that region, and then the color is sort of telling you how much energy does an average person in that particular nation state have access to. And you can see that this is a logarithmic color scale, so there's 2 orders of magnitude variation on this plot, going from bluish green to orangey red. And so you can see an enormous variation in per capita access around the world. And as we heard in the previous panel, there are roughly 3 billion people who do not have access to fossil fuels, which is sort of translated to not having access to adequate quantities of energy. And so there is a second inconvenient truth, the pun is intended here, and that is that we should expect large, that is, the estimates range from about a factor of 2 to about a factor of 4, depending upon whose estimates you take, but a significant increase in global energy demand, and particularly in electricity demand, by mid-century. And so that's borne out in this sort of a forecast. I took this in particular from the U.S. Energy Information Agency, showing projected evolution in world energy consumption in the OECD, non-OECD states, and then the world totals. And you can see particularly the significant increase in the developing world here. And in fact, by around now, the so-called quote-unquote developing world is consuming more energy than we are in the developed world. The reason that we're here today is because of these previous facts, plus this issue. This is emission trajectories for carbon dioxide emissions as a function of year. And then, so the orange curve going, my laser pointer's battery has died. I guess we don't have enough energy. So this is the business as usual curve that David, thank you, spoke about. Find the on button here. There we go. So this is the business as usual trajectory that we're sort of following in terms of carbon emission trajectories. And then these various curves here are the emission trajectory that one would have to follow in order to hit whatever final CO2 concentration that you choose as your final target. And so the temperature changes that we're sort of looking at are a couple degrees would sort of be this sort of yellowish trajectories here. And you notice that the emissions have to peak essentially now or in the next few years. If you're feeling lucky and you feel like you can go to 550, then the peak has to be in maybe 2025 or 2030 and so forth. And the issue then for squaring that circle is that we need to meet these kinds of emission trajectories, but we also need to meet the legitimate energy demands of 10 billion people instead of just the energy demands of a few. And so the gap that exists between this business as usual trajectory, and yeah, you can argue, can we bend this over by changing how we use energy a bit? But nonetheless, this gap has to be filled by suitable clean energy sources. The bottom line is that we need tens of terawatts of carbon-free power on the timescales that we're interested in here. This is a wonderful paper. It's 3 pages long. It's an easy read. But Hoffert goes through and basically tries to figure out how do we meet these two competing needs, human energy demand and the limitations from climate change. And so the scale is important here. To put this in perspective, what's a terawatt? It doesn't mean much to most people. And so this is a scale showing 12 orders of magnitude from a factor of 1 to a factor of 1 trillion. So a compact fluorescent light bulb is maybe 10 watts of power consumption. A toaster is about 1,000 watts. An airplane engine is maybe 1 million watts. A large nuclear power plant or coal-fired power plant is about 1 billion watts. And a terawatt is 1,000 of these, okay? And we need, the current global energy demand is around 14 trillion watts. If you did it all from one source, of course, no one would do that. That's 14,000 nuclear or coal-fired power plants. It's 20,000 barrels of oil a second, 14 million wind turbines roughly, or 40,000 square miles of PV cells. That's today's energy demand. And the challenge is we need to replace this with clean energy plus at least another amount of energy roughly equal to this from clean energy sources. That's what we've got to do. Our scalable options are limited, and I explicitly put a nota bene here. End-use gains and efficiency improvements are absolutely key here, but for lack of time, we're just talking about sources. And the sources that really scale to that challenge, of course, we've got enough fossil fuels around to get us in deep trouble, probably for the rest of this century, so we're not going to talk about those too much. And the things that do scale is the renewables, wind, solar PV, solar thermal, advanced biofuels that we're going to hear about in the afternoon talk, and nuclear sources. And so what you're going to hear about today is these topics. And so Carlos is going to talk about the challenges and opportunities for integrating renewable energy into our power grid, the problems of resource forecasting, demand response, and how far that can get us. Byron Washam will be talking about sort of, this is my words, not Byron's, reinventing the power grid, using the microgrid as a new architecture for our energy distribution system, electrical energy distribution. Shirley Mang is an expert on energy storage, both for transportation and for utility scale energy storage. And then I'm going to talk about the role and need for next generation nuclear energy. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Carlos.